Welcome to Franklin Covey's C-Suite Conversations. My name is Patrick Leddin, and each week I have the honor of sitting down and talking to a senior leader. I learn about their life and their work, their career, things that they've done well, and also the struggles they had to overcome, all with one thought in mind: to help you in your leadership journey. Today I'm joined by Chuck Ferry. He's a decorated infantry and special operations combat veteran with over 38 years of military and private sector leadership experience. I can tell you, I've known Chuck a long time. He was actually my boss some 30 years ago when we served together in the 82nd Airborne Division. And he's the real deal when it comes to being a combat veteran. If you've ever seen Black Hawk Down, Chuck was one of the guys really on the ground that day. He's recently served and returned to a company called APR Energy. It's a fast power infrastructure company. He's a chairman and CEO, and he's simultaneously the CEO of a company called Duos Technologies. He deals with both leading a private and a public sector organization. In our conversation today, we'll talk about the role of a leader, an executive leader, when it comes to identifying talent, helping to groom individuals, position them effectively for success, model for leaders as well as team members, and build a culture that he describes that's truly effective. You're going to want to grab something to write with, sit back and take some notes as Chuck and I have a 30-year reunion, but more importantly, a C-Suite conversation. Chuck Ferry, welcome to Franklin Covey's C-Suite Conversations.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. I don't know if the audience knows this other than a little bit of the background I gave you. Maybe they made the connection, but you and I served together in the Army some 30 years ago. You were my boss in the Army. And when I was thinking recently about guests who have made it into the C-suite, if you will, in your career, I thought, boy, folks can learn a lot from Chuck Ferry, not only from your time in the military, but also what you've done throughout your career. So if you don't mind, would you mind laying the track a little bit on your career?
Yeah, so usually I go from kind of now backwards, so I'll just do that so I don't screw it up. So I've been I'm currently the chairman and CEO of APR Energy, and simultaneously I'm also the CEO for a publicly traded company called Duos Technologies. So I run a privately held company on the one side with APR, and a publicly traded company on the left side with Duos Technologies. Prior to from 2020 to 2024, I've been running Duos Technologies, and we just recently, I will say, reacquired the assets of APR Energy and have stood up the second company. So from 2016 to 2020, I was actually the COO and president, and then later CEO of APR Energy, the company whose assets we bought. So I left that company in 2020 after it was acquired by some folks that I didn't really want to work for. And then 4 years later, now I bought those assets back. So now I run these two companies. From 2010 to really to 2016, I was the privileged to be the operating officer for a smaller company called Arma Global. It was a defense contracting company. And that was very, very small when we started, and it got real large. We ended up transacting that with General Dynamics before I joined APR Energy in that role. And then really prior to that time, I did a little bit of light consulting work. I worked for Lockheed Martin for a little bit, but really from 2009 back 26 years, I spent 26 years on active duty in the United States Army, which included time as an enlisted man, NCO, and officer, all with service in infantry, ranger, and special operations units throughout that entire time. And that included 4 years of combat, 48 months in Mogadishu, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So I retired from that in 2009 and started learning this thing called business. And somehow that's kind of how I got here.
Well, thanks for your service. I really appreciate it. And oftentimes you'll see a commercial for like a recruiting commercial for the military, and you see people doing all these things like jumping out of planes and sliding down ropes out of helicopters and things like that are attractive in ads. But most people don't do those things when they're in the service. You did all those things and so much more. You actually hit a point that I think would be really interesting for the audience. So maybe they aren't themselves coming out of the military and kind of transitioning into business, but they may be making some transitions from different roles, either from industry to industry, changing markets, moving geography, changing jobs, just companies. I mean, what did you learn through that? Because I'm sure that's it's a pretty quick learning cycle to go, okay, I'm going from an environment that I know really, really well to something that's new to me in business. What did you learn yourself, Chuck, as you navigated that?
Well, first off, it was coming out of the Army after 26 years. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to do anything else. I thought I was pretty good at my craft. Uh, and so I finally determined after a lot of, trepidation that, well, lots of other people do it. So if they can do it, why can't I? So that's kind of how I had no idea what I wanted to do, or where it would take me. So coming out of the Army and transitioning into my first job, which is for about a year with Lockheed Martin, was it's very, very different for me. And then since that time, I've been kind of in the defense contracting industry, and then I went to the power industry, and then I changed again to the technology industry, and now I've kind of got my foot back over in the power industry. I think what I found every single time, the military actually prepared me quite well for it, is that, especially as an officer in the Army, pretty much about every 2 or 3 years, you're going to change assignments. And all those assignments are not the same. So, when I worked, with you, Patrick, I really was an infantry officer, had just come out of combat in Mogadishu. And then I get put into this staff job where I'm now the personnel officer, or the lead for HR, of a 3,000 man Army brigade. I didn't know what the heck I was doing and had to learn, very, very quickly. And what I found as I've kind of done that every single time, it's really all about the people that you serve with, whether you're working for them, whether they're colleagues, or whether they're your subordinates. In every single job, whether it was in the military or in my civilian career, I have learned just a lot from those three categories. You don't just learn from bosses, you learn from colleagues, and you also learn a lot from subordinates, good subordinates. In the civilian world, the subordinate we had when we worked together, we had a personnel non-commissioned officer or sergeant, very experienced. He knew all the rules. He kept us out of trouble, right? He taught us. He was constantly teaching us. In my civilian work, especially around finance, because I've never been trained formally around finance, I've really relied upon my chief financial officers and some of the other finance professionals to really, really teach me, the financial part and the financial language of business. And so that's just a common theme, I think, at least in my experience across, those transitions.
It's so funny. I remember Sergeant Ortiz was his name, and when you said that, I'm like, I know exactly who you're talking about, because I was an infantry guy myself, and it's kind of like, we don't know this world, and I think that actually translates so nicely to like the role you're in right now, or somebody in a C-suite. You don't know all the roles that everybody's doing around you. I mean, you may have touched a few of those as you've grown up, if you will, in learning your craft, but you don't necessarily know everything about marketing, everything about financing, how accounting works, and what gap standards are. You don't necessarily know everything about HR. You have to surround yourself and build some trust with these folks. Is that fair?
It absolutely is. And again, early after I got out of the Army, I got the chance to be the operating officer for this small company called Arma Global. And I had never really run contracting from a civilian perspective. I had never really run HR from a civilian perspective, IT, operate, all the other components that it takes to put together a business, along with all the finance and all that sort of stuff. And so it was a lot of learning as I got into my second and third and now fourth roles in really being a COO and later CEO. You have to remind yourself that, okay, I know just enough about all these different business functions to be very dangerous, but I still need to make sure I listen to the professionals, that have been trained and have been in those crafts for their entire lifetime. Sometimes as a more senior leader, and you could remember this is in the Army, right? You get a more experienced Army commander, and sometimes they think they know everything, and they kind of lose that thing where they don't really want to listen to the subordinates before they make decisions. They just, well, I know better than everybody else, so I just make the decisions. I've tried to kind of not fall into that trap. I kind of followed that philosophy when I was in the Army, leading combat units, and I've tried to follow that philosophy with the companies that I've led. And again, I am literally in this company right now surrounded by just an outstanding team of individuals that are absolute, top notch in their skill sets. And when you bring it all together and make it work together as a team, that's where the real magic happens.
So when you were describing your role, Chuck, and you said you have these two senior roles across two organizations, I immediately thought, like, how do you juggle that? I mean, what does that even look like? How interconnected are they from a business perspective? I mean, do you find yourself saying, okay, which hat am I wearing at the moment? And just take us into that world of kind of trying to handle one that's public and one that's private.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, this is the third time being a public CEO is a different animal from being a private CEO. Um, and we can talk more about that maybe in a bit. But so what's interesting with the arrangement we have right now, so uh, basically I've got two companies, but effectively they're both run out of the same building, largely with the same staff. I know it sounds a little crazy. So what we have is we have new APR Energy that really bought the assets from my old company called APR. We also bought the trademarks. We're using this APR Energy, and it's sponsored by a Fortress Investment Group that basically help buy all the assets and then capitalize that business. So really they own the assets, but they don't have a staff to run those assets right this moment. So what they did is, so an asset management agreement back over here at Duos, which is my other company, we basically help run those assets, from cradle to grave on that side. And so on the Duo side, we almost run it like another large contract, if you will, for that. But we're effectively sharing the staff. So like in Army terms, it's almost like, look, I'm taking on another large unit, right? And I'm using the same staff to kind of exercise, kind of command and control across, the two organizations, if that makes sense.
It does make sense to me. I'm thinking as you were going through that oftentimes when I talk to senior leaders, sometimes they're running a public business, sometimes they're running a private business, and there's always a hint, at least, of those who are running the public business saying, I wish it was still private. And those who are running the private business, depending upon the arrangement of that private business, they sometimes feel like, I wish all these other people didn't try to have their hands in the business, and maybe I'd have some more flexibility or access to capital. I mean, you're kind of holding both of those sides. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the pros and cons.
So my public company, it's Duos Technologies, DOT. It's publicly traded on the NASDAQ, and you really got to think of it as a micro cap, is what they call it. And it's really, I would say, still kind of in a startup mode. So it's still working to get to profitability, which is true for a lot of NASDAQ microcap companies. It's very normal. And in that business, we have a very sophisticated set of technologies that we use called our Railcar Inspection Portal. And we have a bunch of patents and all that stuff. So it's not an unusual technology-based NASDAQ company. But that being said, even though it's small, you still have to follow and comply with all of the rules that any publicly traded company, regardless of its size, you have to do that. So as a public company CEO, one of the things that's different from being private is number one, you got to be careful what you say publicly, because if you misstep or mislead or misguide, it could be perceived as, one, being unethical, because that's why they have rules for publicly traded companies on the SEC. But also, two, you don't want to inadvertently harm your shareholders, by making any of those missteps. So we spend a little extra time before we do like earnings calls, press releases, and things like that to make sure that what we say publicly, is compliant. And we work very hard to be transparent, honest, and forthright. So we're not ever getting sideways with the SEC. You don't think about it. You do think about those things when you're private, but you probably don't. There's not as much of an emphasis on it, at least when you're publicly speaking. Is kind of the difference, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. As you were talking through that, earlier on, we were talking about your people and surrounding yourself with great people. It just got me thinking about what Franklin Covey does in regard to their clients they work with. So they oftentimes break their work up into things they do to develop contributors, which would be individual contributors as well as leaders at every level. Then they around cadence, which how do we create a cadence of execution so we can get our goals accomplished? How do we put a system in place? And then lastly, the third C they talk about is culture. So it's kind of contributors, cadence, and culture. I just love to pick that apart, Chuck, because I know you have some great thoughts around individual contributors and rhythms of getting things done. So if you could just talk a little bit about like how do CEOs or even throughout your career, what have you learned about like developing really good individual contributors? How organizations do that, what you learned yourself as you were growing up and being kind of growing into a more leadership role. Just love to hear your thoughts on how to create great contributors.
So I think a common theme, I think, for all good organizations, and is where when organizations take the time to develop the talent within their ranks. One of the things that I love doing is actually bringing in younger college students initially as interns, matching them with some older, more experienced, either individual contributors or leaders, and watching them grow. Kind of like when we brought in brand new soldiers or lieutenants into the Army. It was a real joy and pleasure to watch kind of that raw talent come in and begin to learn and grow. And then I think, all good organizations then will have, and good leaders that care about the organizations will take those younger or newer employees and put them in the right place, kind of at the right time. It kind of matches their talent, that gives them the opportunity then to not only become better as individuals, but also provide the best contribution to the organization. And so I think most business leaders will think about, we have individual contributors, sometimes will stay in that skill set for like 30 years, and that now you're probably paying them a lot of money, but you still need that individual skill set. And you don't necessarily need them to be a leader. Okay. And then there's another track where individual contributors eventually become leaders. Okay. And now they're managing a bunch of individual contributors. And what I find, certainly in the civilian world, in the Army, we start teaching leadership at a very, very, very young age. What I've found generally across the companies that I've been run, a lot of folks don't start getting into real leadership positions until they're kind of in like their 30s or even 40s. And so somebody like me just assumes that when they were in their 20s, they were getting all this leadership training. It's actually not true. So you got to kind of step back, say, okay, look, I got somebody that's in their 30s and 40s. They got real high potential. And now I need to start giving them, assignments and opportunities to kind of stretch their legs and become better leaders. The other aspect of leadership, I think, especially if you're running like a technology company or a company that is, involved in deploying technology, like we build power plants and other things like that. You've got what I call technical leadership, and then I'll say broader leadership, right? So the leadership skill that you need as a chief operating officer can be a little broader and not quite as deep into the technical areas, depending on what kind of organization you're running. But then, like, if you're the head of engineering, like I have my head of engineering here, his name's Ned Bushelman. He's one of those guys who's kind of in his mid 30s, maybe early 40s, and really just now getting the opportunity to lead, let's say, about 16 to 20 engineers. And so you got kind of, I'll say, engineering stuff where you're kind of organizing people, you're keeping them on task, all that sort of stuff. But then you got the real nitty gritty technical leadership where you're training engineers how to get to be better engineers. And so I always kind of look at those in kind of two categories. And I didn't really start thinking it like that until I was probably my second or third civilian company with engineers inside that.
As you were going through that, I'd love to kind of dissect that a little bit more. So on the individual contributor side, as I was hearing you say it, you kind of have as they're growing up, as people are beginning to become, get the role, start to give their own individual contribution to the role. There are some people who stay on that technical path, and they might stay on that technical path for the remainder of their career, and they become very strong experts in a technical craft. They're kind of like solid citizens who know something extremely well, and they're not going to go into a leadership role beyond leading themselves.
Yep.
But then there's other ones that branch over. So on that technical side, like many organizations, probably people listening, they have some people, maybe they're computer programmers who are just they're the bomb at what they do, and they're going to keep them in that role forever, and but still give them challenges. And the question becomes, beyond pay, what other things have you found that help those people throughout their career, like want to continue to contribute their best? Because I could see at some point, some people might lose interest, or the other side is sometimes we look at them and say, well, what do you mean you don't want to be in a leadership role? I just love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, and boy, I've had some experience with that, both good and bad, and I made some mistakes around it as well. So I think so let's say you got real high technical skill set. So I'll just use my current business as an example. I have software developers, I have hardware engineers, electrical, mechanical, and optical. I have IT, engineers and specialists, and then I have artificial intelligence developers. Okay, all these really super high technical things, and some of the folks in there absolutely love being behind the keyboard, doing what it is that they do. They thrive at it. Okay, and some of them don't want to be leaders. Okay, and then you have other similar. The person next to them is behind the keyboard, and they're like, I want to be a leader. And I think the key for us as more senior leaders is to figure out, okay, who wants to be a leader and who doesn't want to be a leader. And sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we make mistakes where we take a technical leader. We're like, man, this guy is absolutely like the best software developer on the planet. He would probably be a great pick to lead a 10-man software development team. So we pluck him out of there. He's got some trepidations. He's nervous about it. We say, don't worry, you're going to do great. And we throw him in there, and then we don't go back and assess how he's doing. Come to find out 6 to 9 months later, you go back in and you check, and the organization has not progressed. The leader that you made the leader is not happy. He really wants to be behind the keyboard. And so we may have picked the wrong guy or gal. Okay. Alternatively, you've got super good technical leaders that really do want to be broader leaders. And so I think what it is, you got to find the ones that want to do one or the other, and then kind of put them on those paths. When you try to mismatch, sometimes we make mistakes, and we have to start over, and it causes frustration not only for us, but also for the individual that you're maybe trying to get into that leadership track or not.
I was thinking as you were saying that, I jotted down earlier, Chuck, when you were talking about developing people and developing leaders. You said specifically, it's a joy and a pleasure, is how you said it, and it just made me think about the role of a leader in your role or other leaders in your organization when it comes to kind of like understanding where people's talents are, where their passions are, where their interests are, positioning them for success, challenging them appropriately, all of those type of things. It takes a lot of time and energy to do it and do it well. And going into it, you're not going to get them all right. So there's going to be failures, and you have to learn from that as well. How much of that joy and pleasure piece in your mind has to be there in order for you to really develop people well?
I think any CEO or senior leader that's worth their salt spends a lot of their time thinking about their people. That's just my opinion. You have, there's business leaders out there that they think about their finance stuff first, and I have people. I think about it reverse. I'm kind of like, look, if I've got the right people in the right place with the right talent at the right time, they will make the numbers for me. They will make the organization successful. So I think after watching a bunch of really good leaders in the Army and a bunch of different leaders in the civilian world, the best ones that I could pick out on both sides were really people oriented, and they were really keen. Number one, they were good recruiters. So they were very good at recruiting. And then they were pretty good, and they had a good eye for kind of where to put people into their organizations. and then they got a good eye for picking people out that may not ordinarily get noticed, and ask folks the hard question like, hey, if you could pick anybody inside our organization to come into your team, who would you pick? And that question will sometimes surprise a leader. You're like, well, I want this lady that's over in this other section over here. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, oh, I've been watching her. I think if I could have her over on my team, I think she'd kill it. And so again, I think any good senior leader has really got to think about their people and how they're organized often. And if they're not thinking about it, I think they're going to make mistakes.
As you were saying that, I thought about what senior leaders say when people, what senior leaders see when people come around compared to what happens when they're not around, right? So when you ask that question of like, who do you want to have on your team? Sometimes you're surprised because you're not in the room when people see the great stuff that person is doing. Or conversely, the people who seem like they're doing the great stuff when you're in the room, maybe they kind of lean back a little bit when you're not.
Well, I think it's, I've seen some leaders that will form their opinion, let's say, of subordinates or of subordinate organizations based on what they see themselves. In my opinion, good leaders will have 3 or 4 different sources that they will rely upon. They'll have different kind of information channels that come up that will help them form hopefully a better opinion of individuals and organizations before they jump to any conclusions or make maybe important decisions about what to do with an individual or an organization. So I typically will always rely on numerous sources, because I know if I'm basing somebody only on my own information, I'm likely to not see the full picture and not make maybe as good of a decision as I could around, an individual or an organization or a project or something that we're working on.
Yeah, that's I love that insight. I think that's so good about the idea of like listening to other people, getting other voices, looking for other ways, and recognizing that you can be biased, and sometimes you're only seeing part of the story is really, really critical. The other part you mentioned earlier was that the idea of like when somebody jumps into or moves into a leadership role, sometimes it's a big move to make, and oftentimes it doesn't come to a little bit later than you were experiencing in the past, and also without a lot of training and development. In fact, there was this study that was published a number of years ago, and HBR talked about it, that the average age for someone to get their first formal leadership position is 30, and the average age for someone to get their first formal leadership training is 42. So that's like that's a 12-year gap that's filled by experiences and banging your knee a few times and trying to figure it out. And it also causes some people that maybe they could have made that leap if they'd been mentored or had some training, that they didn't make it, and now they didn't do that well as a leader. Now they feel like I couldn't have cut it, but maybe they just didn't get the right developmental opportunities. So that's a pretty big gap, right?
It is. I think again, it comes from all the time in the military, where we learned, hey, one of your prime responsibilities is to develop your subordinate leaders. And so it's just something that, I just do. I have met folks that have never been in the military that feel the same way. But unfortunately, in the civilian arena, leadership training is a much more informal, kind of catch as you can thing. And I think that really great organizations have leaders, regardless of their background, that take the time to think about how to develop their subordinate leaders and their key employees that they have. In the company I have right now, I have obviously a management team, CFO, chief operating officer, counsel, CIO, and then a number of other, kind of subordinates and kind of a next layer down. And I always think about, hey, how number one, am I being a good example for them? That's the first thing. That's the best way to teach, right? And how you go about, taking information, how you go about asking questions, how you go about treating people, how you go about, providing performance evaluations, things like that, right? A personal example. And what I found that when you do that, I now have subordinate leaders that start to emulate that, whether they realize it or not. Right? Hopefully that's a good thing, right? And they're doing that now down with their own subordinates to kind of create that, so that's, so I mean, I do that all the time. And I think other good leaders, CEOs, in good organizations also do that as well.
When we were starting to talk, I talked about these three buckets of kind of contributors, cadence, and culture. And we talked a lot about contributors, but I would just love to hear your thoughts, Chuck, on, so you're developing some great people and you're modeling for them and you're kind of helping them see what's possible and investing in them, positioning them, etc. But we know that good people put in bad systems tend to generate bad results because the system plays up such a role in it. We also know that good people, even with their best intentions, sometimes will exist in an organizational culture that can be a little bit problematic. I'd love to hear your thoughts on just how do you create a system that lets you execute on goals? What have you learned about that? And then also, how do you build a strong culture around your folks?
So, I've grown up in my entire life. I think good organizations are performance-based organizations, merit-based organizations. In other words, it's not how long you've been there; it's how well you perform is what counts. In somewhat of a competitive environment. So, I'm a big believer in, having performance metrics, all the way down to the last person in the organization. But everybody understands what they are and how they contribute to the larger, broader organization. In terms of culture is everything. And culture really does start with the CEO. So if the CEO comes in all grumpy and pissed off in the morning every day, guess what? Everybody's like that all day long, right? If the CEO comes in, he's in a good mood, he's approachable, he asks questions, he appreciates people's inputs. People will actually talk to me, and they'll actually give me good ideas, because what we want to do is foster a culture where people are, people are resourceful, people want to work hard, people love coming to work, people don't want to let you down or the organization down. People won't say that's not my, if someone says, well, that's not my job. Oof, that's not good for me, right? It's like, hey, what can I do today to help the organization, right? And when you have a culture like that where everybody's kind of pitching in and they're kind of bought into that, organizations can do a lot more than others that are kind of, might even have more people in them or whatever. So you can do kind of more with less when you got a company that's really working together as a team and enjoys that camaraderie and that teamwork.
Yeah, as you were describing it, when I kind of pieced it all together, what I hear you saying, especially from the very beginning, around I mentioned when you said it's like a joy and pleasure for people to do well, but then also this, hey, people can't say things like it's not my job. When I put it all together, that whole conversation, it's kind of like we want a culture where, like, I care a lot about my people, but I also expect a lot from my people, and my people should expect a lot from me. It's that kind of culture where it's performance based, but it's also, there's a heart for the people in the process of it as well.
It is. So I kind of break that, because people will come, as I've gotten older, I try to make things even simpler, because it's just where I am in life right now. It's like, say, well, what do I need to be successful in your company? I'm like, you really need three things. It's very simple, and it comes from a book I read when I was a young lieutenant in the Army, and I still have the book on my desk over there. It's called, Small Unit Leadership. It's basically three things: skill, will, and teamwork, right? So you got to have the skill to be able to do your job, right, and to be a contributor to the organization. But at the same time, you got to have will, and by will, that means that you're willing to put the effort in. You're willing to come to work. You're willing to deal with problems. You're willing to work through difficult situations. You're willing to put in the extra effort. And then the third one is teamwork, right? If you can be the smartest person on the planet with the most skill and will on the planet, but if you can't operate inside a team, I've got nothing for you. So if someone doesn't have all the skill, that's okay. If you got a lot of will and you're willing to work as a team, we'll bring your skill up, right? Mm-hmm. It's a little bit harder if you don't have the will or if you don't have the teamwork. And unfortunately, over the years, I've had to let folks go that are super, super high talented skill wise, They just couldn't operate as a member of the team. They made everybody else miserable. So unfortunately, we had to let them go and bring somebody else in.
Years ago, I remember a time where I had somebody who kind of was in that bucket in regard to they had tremendous skill, but they didn't have tremendous will, especially around teamwork. And I, as a leader, sadly, didn't address it right away. I didn't really deal with it. I just kind of let that elephant grow. And I can tell you, folks, it became a 14,000-pound pachyderm in the office, and it didn't get better.
Don't worry, everybody does it, Patrick. We all, it happens. I think, one of the toughest, it's easy to be a leader when things are going well and everybody's happy, but real leaders get paid to deal with problems, every day. And sometimes those problems, unfortunately, are employees or subordinate leaders that don't hit one of those three things: skill, will, or teamwork. And, the toughest decisions are sometimes to exit them from your business. And that's part of being a leader.
Well, hey, Chuck, as we wrap up the conversation, you've had quite a career journey, as we've talked about. There's people listening to this podcast are kind of all over the place in their career. They might be early on. They might be kind of mid-career. They might be tipping their toe in the water and saying, do I want to move into a leadership role that's been offered to me? They might be in the C-suite. They might be all sorts of places. What have you learned is, like, regardless of where you are in the journey, folks, here's one good piece of advice from Chuck Ferry that'll help you regardless of the next step you want to take.
A lesson I learned from my father, who was a World War II Silver Star winner. He told me right before I went in the Army when I was 17, he goes, if you want to be a good leader, you have to be willing to sometimes get, out in front and do it yourself. And so if you're don't ask anyone to do anything that you would not be willing to do yourself. And sometimes you have to be willing to show people that you're willing to do it yourself. Anyway, my dad taught me that, and I haven't forgotten. So
that's a pretty good lesson.
It's probably some other good stuff, but that's one I can think of right now.
I love it. Well, hey, man, it's good to see you. I told the folks on the front end that you and I probably haven't talked in a few decades, a couple of weeks, but it's been a few decades, and it's so good to see you, Chuck. I wish you all the best, and just keep doing great things, developing people, developing leaders, building organizations. Thanks so much for joining us for a C-Suite conversation.
Thanks. It's good to see you again, Patrick.
Well, folks, that's all I have for today. Big thanks to Chuck Ferry for joining me for a C-Suite conversation. I so enjoyed the opportunity to hear him talk about developing individual contributors and leaders, and ultimately creating a culture where people are excited to come to work every day and make a contribution that matters. That's all I have for today. Thanks so much for joining me. My name is Dr. Patrick Leddin. Now go make it a great day.